In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. You might have heard about it. Ever since then, that wall has been coming down on us. It's been coming down on the whole world. The world of 2016 is shocking when you compare some of the things that were present in the 80s and are now so changed in the current year. But you won't have heard about that. So let me tell you about it. Not very long ago, democracies were proliferating. I was looking at the statistics this morning on the internet. Dozens upon dozens of democracies, new democracies in countries that never had it, were being created in the 1970s, 80s. It was startling. Democracies were proliferating. The Arab Spring was flowering. That came after 89, but not that long after 89. People in Tahrir Square in Egypt and in Tunisia and so on and so forth. Developing countries were really developing. BRIC, the famous BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, were flourishing. Look at those countries now. Maybe not India, but look at China now. Look at Brazil now. Look at Russia now. Shocking. Absolutely shocking. And Americans were chanting, "Yes, we can." Does anybody ever remember that? The Americans were chanting, "Yes, we can." Now, we've got turmoil in the Middle East, unbelievable turmoil, one of the worst civil wars this world has experienced. We have thugs in presidential palaces in Russia, in Turkey, in Venezuela, and more of them. And as that curve of new democracies was climbing up to around 89 and then started to level off, the change is dramatic, and the two curves, the curve for autocracies crossed the curve for democracies around 1990 and has just been going up like that. That's the world you're living in. That's the world I'm giving you to inherit, and anybody in my own generation. There was populism. There is populism around the world. We have populist movements throughout Europe in ways that we haven't seen before. We have a guy with a lot of blonde hair in the United States doing the same thing right now. And we have political paralysis in the American government. We have a Congress that now decides that the president does not have the right to name a Supreme Court justice. These are just a few examples of what's been going on. Why 1989? Well, what was there about 1989? Well, because 1989 was the year that the West declared that capitalism had triumphed. The assumption was that capitalism had triumphed and would continue to flourish. That was dead wrong. That was dead wrong. Capitalism never triumphed. The U.S. was balanced in the period up to 1989. The Soviet Union and the communist states of Eastern Europe were utterly out of balance on the side of their public sectors. In contrast, the European democracies and the United States, countries like Canada and so on, were balanced across their different sectors. Government was strong in the government before '89, much stronger. In fact, there were huge welfare programs in the United States. Taxes were high in the United States in the 1970s when the country was flourishing economically, and yet taxes were high. The U.S. was flourishing politically, socially, and economically post-war. The U.S. was the place to go to or the place to emulate for 200 years. It was the model of democracy. And maybe the greatest flourishing of all for that period was post-war, 1945 to 1989. The country was flourishing on every dimension. It had the Vietnam War, but domestically the country was flourishing. As I said, It flourished despite high taxes, despite extensive welfare programs, and despite much greater income equality, not inequality. That's what was happening. Since then, look what's happening now. The US has gone out of balance on the side of the private sector, and it's proving to be no better than what was happening in Eastern Europe on the side of the public sector. They swung one way, we're now swinging the other way, and it's devastating. It's devastating for that country. Look at some of the statistics. Incarceration rates in the United States, highest in the world. Obesity, second highest after Mexico. Drug use, enormous amount, illicit drug use. I'm not talking about pharmaceuticals. Income disparities growing unstoppably, absolutely unstoppably. Voter turnout, what a shock. That in America, of all places, the land of contemporary democracy, voter turnout goes down. And social mobility, which is really the shocking thing. Social mobility means the chances of a child doing well, a child from a poor family doing well. In Canada, a child from a poor family has 4 times as much chance now of doing well as a child from a poor family in the United States. This is the United States. This is when I grew up in the 60s and the 70s and 50s and so on, that was a place to admire. Everything about the United States was better in our view. Everything about the United States was wonderful. What a change. What a change. And and to my mind, it's this fallacy that somehow capitalism triumphed, whereas capitalism didn't triumph. Balance triumphed, but now capitalism is triumphing and balance is losing. This is you can talk about a couple of dominant paradigms in the world today. The first one is the economic dogma that says that greed is good. You all know the piece in the movie about greed is good. Markets are sufficient. Property is sacred, and governments are suspect. This is what's kind of captured us in some ways. As one view of human nature, this may make some sense, but as the view of human nature, it's utter nonsense. But that's what we're living with today, and it's shocking. Markets. This is what markets used to look like. Markets were the heart and soul of community. Markets were not only places for trading and places for buying and doing all that as a commercial place. Markets were also the heart and soul of community. You want to see what a market looks like today? That's what a market looks like today. Cold-blooded, numerical, and so on. This is a page from a newspaper that I was reading last week. It's from the International New York Times, and it's one page on the business page out of that newspaper, and it's kind of small for me to see, but the first article is about the LIBOR manipulation of exchange rates that people of some of the most prestigious banks in the world were responsible for. We've got a pharmaceutical business accused of more dishonesty in another article. We've got Shell talking about, or the newspaper talking about Shell with oil spills in Nigeria being contested. And you've got the guy who created fracking in the United States in that particular newspaper being charged with conspiracy. The next day he drove his car into a wall without his seatbelt on. The other paradigm that's dominant these days is this kind of public, dominant for 200 years, is this public-private that we're stuck with. It comes from France, where the Ancien Regime sat on the right, the establishment, and the commoners sat on the left. And we're still stuck with this ridiculous political linear politics, left, right, Karl Marx, Adam Smith, nationalization, privatization, governments, markets, democracy of the proletariat, free enterprise, when the enterprises are free, the people are not free. We're stuck with that, and that has led to, we've had enough of that. And that has led to, you can't balance a chair on two legs. And what we're trying to do is balance a chair on public-private legs. We need a third leg. What we get instead are pendulum politics. France is classic. They keep swinging from left to right, uselessly. Or you get political paralysis, which is what's been happening in the United States under the Obama administration. If Obama came in with "yes, we can," the Congress's motto seems to be "no, we can't." So we need to reconceive how we view the political process. And what we need is a third leg to the stool so it will be balanced, the stool that can sit on three legs. I prefer to call it the plural sector for two reasons. One is the usual labels like civil society or not-for-profits or NGOs, non-government organizations and so on, are not very helpful terms. Plural implies that there's an amazing array of organizations in there. McGill is one, this effort is another, and so on. The plural sector is community-based, just like the public sector is government-based and the private sector is market-based. Many of you, and many people in the world, work in the private sector, and you vote in the public sector. But all of us live in the plural sector. Our clubs, our associations, our affiliations, our communities, and yet it's obscure. People don't talk about it. It's like it doesn't exist because we've got this linear politics and there's no room for the plural sector. By the way, the other reason I like to call it the plural sector is because if we say public-private plural, then people can see it as taking its place alongside the other two sectors. So what is the plural sector? It's community-based. It has associations owned by its members, like co-ops. There are more co-op memberships in the United States today than people in the United States. Maybe 330 million people, 350 million cooperative memberships. Or organizations that are owned by no one. No one owns McGill. The government sometimes thinks it does, the provincial government, but nobody owns McGill. And we have all our trusts and clubs and foundations and churches and unions, and it goes on and on and on. We have social movements for confrontation, like what happened on Wall Street, and we have social initiatives for developing new things. The plural sector is you, the plural sector is me, and this plural sector is especially we. It's all of us as resourceful human beings and not human resources. And we've had wonderful examples today over and over again on this stage and so on, whether it's the singing or the presentations, about how resourceful people can be and the wonderful things they can do. And a lot of that they're doing. Just think of the people who've been talking today. They're not talking from a government perspective. Not too many of them are talking from a business perspective. They're really talking from a plural sector perspective. So we, if anything's going to happen, we have to take the lead. Businesses won't do it. Corporate social responsibility, which I applaud, will not make up for corporate social irresponsibility, as we saw in that newspaper page. And there's just too much of it now. It will not correct. There's no win-win wonderland. I applaud companies that build windmills and so on. I think all that is wonderful, but it will not make up for the problems we've got with the irresponsibility of so many corporations today. Too many governments are co-opted domestically and overwhelmed globally by corporate interests. And so it falls to the plural sector. You know, is it utopian to expect mass collaborative effort in the plural sector? Is it utopian to think that we're all going to rise up and somehow do something? You know what? Is it utopian to sacrifice our planet and our progeny for our greed? That's the real question. Will we rise up? Well, let me give you some examples where people have risen up and done some quite amazing things. There was a Tea Party in Boston once. I'm talking about the one in 1776. There was a Salt March in India once. There was Rosa Parks, just mentioned a few minutes ago on a bus in Alabama. I think the best example is the Quiet Revolution in Quebec. The startling change where people just said, enough of the power and control of the church in this province, enough of that. And this place went in a few years from one of the highest birth rates in the world to one of the lowest. And none of that came about with the social media we have now to interact. So the issue of global warming is an issue of particular concern because we've got to do something about it. I think the Paris conference was a diversion. I think it was entertainment. You watch this on television at night and you don't do anything. It's not a wake-up call. A wake-up call is when your basement is flooded. A wake-up call is when your crops start to fail. That's a wake-up call. And we're going to have to get some wake-up calls. The assumption in Paris is somehow that all these masses of governments, 195 governments, whatever it was, are all going to go home and go through all this whole bureaucratic procedure to do something about global warming. Don't hold your breath. It's not going to happen. It will happen when you and I and other people start to fire up their courage and do the kinds of things that happened with the civil rights movement and the Quebec movement, the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, and so on. So let me close with a quote from Tom Paine. Tom Paine wrote the pamphlet that helped to evoke the American Revolution in 1776. And he said, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And you know what? Paine was right in 1776. Can we be right again now? Can we afford not to be right again now? Thank you.